My name is Blossom.
So you want to be a hero, do you?
Bad day.
Don't you have a magic sword or a protective talisman or something?
Labyrinth beats our hour, and she's
Heroes, she thought.
keep an open mind.
How about if just one of you died?
Great. Just great.
Now, how far from the journey?
I would climb mountains, scale ravines, battle demons.
No, I'm afraid that won't work.
Prove it.
Now, listen very carefully and make sure you do exactly as I say.
What I'd like to talk to you about, obviously, is happy endings. But the other books you've been in as well, if you want to. And also what you're up to now and your prodigious output. Because it seems like that every week there's a little announcement from you on Facebook saying, oh, here's another anthology I'm in.
It's not quite that prodigious, but yeah, we'll talk about that as well. So
yeah, and the aiming for 100 rejections thing as well.
Well, that's tame. I'm aiming. I've already had about 300 this year, so it will be to 500 by the end of the year. It basically means I expect a rejection every day, which is one way of looking at it. Possibly fairly disheartening way of looking at it, but we can talk about strategies on submissions as well.
Yeah, I think that would be useful for other people because clearly,
mainly as what not to do.
What not to do is also good. You know, aim for rejection. If you aim for rejection, at least you're sending stuff out. Don't hoard it in the belief that that's somehow helping.
Well, I mean, that's a fairly good way to start, actually, because that also ties into Liars League. Because I kind of started writing with a fairly I will do this attitude of sending something to Liars League for every one of their themes. This was like 13 years ago now. So I kind of missed the very start of Liars League. I wasn't even aware it existed for the first few of them. When I stumbled upon it, I went, okay, well, there's a theme and a deadline, so let's write for it. And then I kept on sending. So that was the kind of thing was, even though I knew some of them were pretty bad, I would still send something in just because what else was going to keep me honest?
When we first talked about the possibility of publishing something, and you had this massive spreadsheet which you had, where it had previously been published and whether it was still in contract of any kind, and with what you thought of it. So you had your gold list and your silver
Indeed,
list.
yes.
And possibly unsurprisingly, we agreed very much on what was gold and what was silver. And so pretty much all of the gold ones, it was just straight in, and then it was about, okay, so the silver ones, which ones fit with what we've already got? Because there was sort of, thematically, there were some things I was just saying, I am not going to have that, Liam. Thank you.
Well, zombies. Zombies and a few other... Yeah, which is absolutely fine. I know of other people, there's, I think it's... Clark's World are adamant anti-zombies, and that's partly because the guy who runs it had a medical scare a couple of years ago, and he just went, right, the hard horror stuff, not for me anymore. It's very much about appetite for things. So
when it's real, it stops being funny. Yeah.
And well, none of my zombie stories are particularly real,
No,
and some of them I hope are slightly amusing. But people's tastes definitely vary, and that's another thing to learn when you're sending your work off. It's very much not a sort of judgment on a story when it gets rejected. It's a lot more about personal taste.
It's always personal taste. I mean, no matter how much you try not. When I'm reading stuff for anthologies and competitions and what have you, there are some things that are just absolute no-nos. And I try to tell people not to send me them, so it's not. Well,
I think one
year, do they listen?
One of the Liars Leagues, I think it might have been Beginning and End or something, but with a Dead Babies folder.
He was talking about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's probably what reminded me.
Everybody's thinking it'd be so mad.
And bearing in mind she was recently,
at the time.
I think she was, I don't know if she was late stage pregnant or she
was,
delivered about it, but it was very much, this is not a theme that fits very well with where people are. And I think they all came through to us to judge, so Lies League never reject a story outright, as it were, but they get shifted into various folders depending on warnings and levels of we think you might like this versus we don't think you'll like this sort of thing. But it's not a theme that's going to suit someone who's looking forward to motherhood. Obvious reasons.
Yeah. And the other decision we were making very early on this is, are we going to do fantasy or are we going to do science fiction or are we going to do a mix?
Yes, indeed.
And very quickly I fell on the side of the fantasy because it's a richer theme of variety somehow. Even the amount of science fiction you write.
I think it was one of those things where there's probably just about at that time enough science fiction, but I would have been scraping slightly to get the page count in. So that I think there was definitely more fantasy stories at the time. And I definitely didn't want to do a weird cross-genre thing if we had enough. And that was the proviso. If there wasn't enough fantasy, then we would have had to do some sort of hybrid thing. But thankfully there was enough fantasy, and there might have been just about enough science fiction, but I
think it would have been a thinner book.
Yeah.
Just on the sort of wanting enough variety across what was in there.
I suppose the science fiction side, obviously the couple of awards I'd managed to win were both science fiction.
There's Roswell, isn't it?
That would tend to sway towards that, but I still think it was a thinner list of stories.
Yeah. So tell me about the awards.
One of them was the Quantum Shorts Prize, which is a institute out in, Schrodinger's box experiments and all sorts of things of that ilk. And thankfully I had a story that pretty much was already written that kind of fitted the sort of multiverse theory where every time you make a decision, the universe splits into the one, one you make one decision in and the other one you make the other decision in. And the splitting decision in this particular story was a very young girl looking under her bed and whether there was a monster there or not. So that was the decision that she was splitting the universe on every time. So that was a nice, cheery little story, but they liked that actually therefore won that particular prize. And the other one was there used to be a theatre festival in LA, which I believe went the way of certain new regulations about minimum wage and size of theatres, so they don't do the theatre festival anymore, but they're still running the short story contest. They do two. One is in schools in America, and one is open to everybody, including international. So I sent them two stories over 2 consecutive years. One was a finalist, one then the following year actually won it. And I did get kind of invitations out to LA, but that would have completely wiped the prize fund. Also, I didn't actually know whether I'd won it or not, so there was no financial reward for being a finalist, so it would have been quite an expensive trip, which would have been nice because they actually have well-established science fiction actors doing the readings, so people who were in the various Star Trek series and things like that. So I had a Ferengi doing one of my story readings, not as a Ferengi, as the actor. So that was quite a nice thing, although I never actually got to see it because they didn't record it.
Oh,
So that's a bit of a shame.
disappointing.
It is very disappointing in a way. It's kind of not what you expect. But I guess there were various, if you got an actor doing it and then you release it, then there's various other rules and regulations. I don't know. But it was quite curious that they didn't record it. I think I actually recorded my acceptance speech. I recorded two. I didn't get it, and an acceptance speech just in case, depending on what the actual final result on the night was, which was basically very short, but just a quick speech thing. So, yeah.
Do you have any particular favourites in Happy Ending Not Guaranteed?
It's very hard to choose your favourite from lists of stories, and some of them are favourites for different reasons.
Okay, I'll let you have a top three then.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, I for me, the story that starts off the collection, To Be a Hero, is, if not a favourite, then at least it's very much this is my stall, this is my short story ethos, if you like.
Yes, your calling card.
In that, basically, To Be a Hero is a story about not being heroes. It's a story about, the idea that a lot of fantasy stories, you have this effectively, bulletproof, effectively, although there are no bullets in fantasy, bulletproof super hero person who you kind of know is going to defeat the bad person at the end, because that's it always goes. And that's not very interesting to me. And I tend to let things happen to people, and quite often it's quite bad, which on a theme of the whole collection is pretty much why we came up with that sort of title of Happy Ending Not Guaranteed. But To Be a Hero is very typical me, I think, in that if you actually look at it dispassionately, not a lot actually happens. A family goes off to see this wise woman, hoping for a boon or some magical token of some sort, and they go away with a lot less than they think they're going to go away with. And it's very much also dark humour in that the crone is arguing with them that for their son to be a hero, they're both going to have to die, because of course orphans make the best heroes, which is a bit of an upset to them, of course, and they don't quite go along with that particular strategy. So it's playful with the form, but it kind of attempts to puncture the hero idea from the get-go, and that kind of is a very good starting point, because the rest of the stories, there are a lot of heroes involved. A lot of people have things happen to them, some bad, some not quite so bad. It's not all doom and gloom, but very few are exceptional characters. More exceptional things are happening around them or to them. And I know that your favourite from the collection is probably Feathers.
It's certainly up there, yes. Feathers was the story I heard, and then I said, Liam, I want to do a book.
Yeah, well, therefore it's
that was the decider. I mean, because I'd published you a couple of times already, and I kept on turning up at Lions League, and you were there regularly having something read. But that one was, no, I can't hold out anymore. I'm going to ask.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that's the case. I mean, Feathers I love to read out as well.
Yeah.
It's one of my, because it's relatively short, and although the whole thing about Lions League is we have actors doing the readings, there have been a fair few occasions where I've had to read out my own work, including for the launch of Happy Ending. And Feathers is probably one of my go-to reads, because I'm not that good at doing accents. And although it's got two people in it, there's no real need for a particular accent because
No.
statues talking. So what accents would statues talking have anyway? So
And,
it's kind of
and also they're talking in
well,
Morse
they are
code
talking in
anyway,
Morse code encoded in the feathers of pigeons, but I don't actually present the story that way because that would be very laborious for the reader. So we do have to actually we do have to put it into words for them. Otherwise, there'd be very few people willing to get through to the end of that story, which would be a shame.
It would take a while, wouldn't it?
It would take a while, and indeed it does for the statues, which I think is one of the other conceits, is how slow their communication messaging strategy is. So again, it's playful with the form, and it has a bit of a bitter twist sort of ending as well, and therefore it just it falls nicely into place, into shape, I think, which I think is very much. I'm mainly an ideas-based writer, so I come up with an idea and then I write the story. But the most effective stories are the ones where the idea is just the vehicle. There's something else going on, and there's a closure to the story that's kind of natural, and as Vonnegut tends to say, a good story, you should be able to throw away the last page, and someone else should be able to get there based on what you've already written, as it were. Which is a very risky thing to do, but I kind of agree with the principle, which is that, if you get to an end of a story and it's a shock ending that nobody could possibly have seen coming, I always feel cheated. Where if you get to the end of the story and then you look back and go, well, of course that had to happen, then I think, you've done the job of telling a story and being honest about it. The best stories, I think, do that. So an ending for a story is the thing I possibly struggle most with, because they all start from just ideas, and an idea doesn't give you a story arc or an ending necessarily. So the best stories, I think, are the ones that have that sort of closure. So we've done To Be a Hero and Feathers, which are the first two stories actually in the anthology. The third one is a very tricky choice now, because Miscellaneous Spooky Weird is still the story I think has got the most legs, in terms of I'm going to have to actually write something longer at some point with more parts to it.
Have you not done it yet? You've been promising that for...
No, people keep asking for it, and I keep saying I will do it at some point. I've yet to ever promise a timeline, which is very sensible. So yeah, it might happen at some point. I've certainly got a few ideas for it, so it's still rumbling. The latest one actually involved a potential research trip to the Tower of London to go see the Ravens, which was kind of scotched because that was basically in about February or March. So, lockdown happened, and the Ravens are probably very happy. Actually, they're not, apparently, because they steal a lot of food from the tourists.
Yeah, they're lonely, I should imagine.
They do have the Raven Keeper.
Yeah.
The fact there is actually a Raven Keeper at the Tower of London is just inspirational in itself, and I went to a talk he gave at a library in Aldgate, I think it is, which was, I then had to go, well, I'm going to have to put him in the story, aren't I? So that probably leads into the same sort of world. So Miscellaneous Spooky Weird is definitely a strong contender. I also love Blacksley and Whiteclaw, which I suppose from a fantasy basis is the most traditional fantasy story in the collection.
It's probably the longest one as well, isn't it?
Certainly one of the longest. And then there's Kingdom, which is the one that my sister said gave her the heebie-jeebies, which is a good reaction to have for a dark story. And that is very much a story where you ought to be able to see where it's going almost from the first couple of pages, but it still goes there, and it's still a horrible, horrible journey as a result. Which is basically a huge, great riff on the, in the Kingdom of the Blind, the one-eyed man is king. So I have a king of a very small kingdom, and he's the only person in the kingdom who can actually see, which is kind of horrible and tragic. And there are reasons for it, which I won't go into, and it ends horribly, which I won't get into, but is definitely kind of inevitable from that basic setup.
Yeah.
But I'm probably going to have to go for miscellaneous spooky weird.
Yeah.
I have to write more, and the only other story I've potentially been asked to actually write a sequel to is The King's Computer, which of course isn't in this collection because it's in one of the other Arachne books.
Exactly.
It's in Liberty Tales. But somebody got that as a
write? Well, I mean, the way it ends, it's not an obvious one to have a sequel, but...
No, but they actually asked for a sequel. And I went, I can't possibly write a sequel because I generally don't write sequels. But then I started thinking about it and went, yeah, it's possible, it's doable. So I have the intro to that sequel, but I don't have the story yet. So at some point I'll probably finish that off and send it to the people who ask for it, and see if they like it. There's always a possibility they don't, of course, but there you go. That's the breaks for sending stuff to editors.
Indeed. Yes, I think the other one in here that stayed with me, as opposed to being a favourite necessarily, is Greenwich Noon, which you could have written for me. Yeah, that would have fitted in almost any of the Solstice Shorts ones, and why you didn't, I don't know. But anyway.
Well, I think because you tended to prefer, for the Solstice Shorts, it was originals, and that one went to League, and League accepted it. Under my only ever pseudonym listed Lies League story, actually. I think that was a theme they didn't have enough entries for, and Katie asked if I had something else when they went in and sued them, and unfortunately both of them got picked, which is why it ended up being published under the pseudonym as well, which is very rare. I've never had a Lies League theme in which two of my stories got read before.
No.
So yeah. But no, Greenwich Noon is very much
a bleak story.
It's very bleak, but it's also inspired by, you go around the Greenwich Observatory and you look at the whole attempt to do the longitude problem that they had, and the various harebrained schemes they were coming up with to try and do it, including cannons in a plane all the way around the world. And the powder of sympathy, which is a real thing, or they thought was a real thing. And they actually did attempt this experiment, but on dogs. And I went, I can't write from the perspective of a dog. So I made it much bleaker and much more horrible by having a pair of twins on whom these experiments were conducted in order to try and communicate when it was noon halfway around the world. So yeah, it's very, very bleak, although in the slightly redeeming nature, there is at the end of the story, she does take her revenge, so there is that, I suppose. Yeah.
So let's talk about the other stories of yours that we've published in other books.
Well, it all starts, of course, with
aversion to being published by me. We have actually published it quite a bit. I
think 7. I was counting 7. But it all started with London Lies, which was pretty much the anthology I was ever published in.
Really?
So, because, as I said, it kind of... I set myself the goal of writing for Lies League, and that was sufficient at that point because I was also full-time employed. So as long as I wrote a story and sent it off to Lies League every month, I was still a writer. And I wasn't really trying to get them owned anywhere else. So that was very much more a thing that I've done since then, partly because of the body of stories, both accepted and rejected by Lies League. I'm simultaneously the most accepted and most rejected submitter, which is kind of inevitable if you submit for every theme ever kind of thing, which is not true, but is nearly true. So I wasn't really looking for poems for a lot of the stories, so it wasn't until you basically came along and went, I want to do Lies League anthologies, and therefore it wasn't me looking, it was you looking, that kind of led to that first anthology. It was fairly close, though. I did have another story which went into a charity anthology at almost the same time, but London and I still comes first in the list of anthologies that I'm in.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Our first anthology, your first anthology.
Indeed. First of 100 for me. Slightly over 100 now, but first of
that is
100
impressive.
anthologies which have my work in. Some of them are
making a living from this yet?
No, of course, hell no.
No, of course not.
I would honestly claim that anybody who intends to make a living from short stories should have their head examined.
Yeah.
You can, but it's a little bit like, the J.K. Rowling-esque, that's who everyone thinks that every author is aspiring to be, whereas almost there's only one person who is J.K. Rowling making that much money from the stories that she wrote. There are other people who do similar things, but there are a very small number of people who make an honest living, I suppose, out of just writing. There tend to be other things that you do. Now, I made my money doing boring software and for financial companies in London, which basically allowed me to take 2 sabbaticals, one of which ended just about the point I found out about Lies League, so I wasn't really writing very much during that one, and the second one, which I'm still on, pretty much, which is quite a long sabbatical now, but I am writing full-time in as much as anybody does anything for full-time when you're your own boss. Yeah. We're at quite enough deadlines to keep you honest. So. But yeah, 100 anthologies. Some of them were drabbles. A fair few of them are either charity or unpaid. The number of them that are kind of what is considered pro-rate for science fiction or fantasy is relatively small, but that's not the reason for doing it, really. Making the money is a nice way of keeping score, if you like, but it certainly doesn't pay.
So this prolific output, talk to me about the rejection rates.
Okay, so I think LitHub did this a while ago. They published an article which was basically why you should aim for 100 rejections a year. And the principle is very much as you were saying. If you don't get your work out there, nobody will ever see it. And rejections are part of the business of getting your work out there. Industry sort of standard sort of rejection rates are, you get 1 in 10 acceptances is kind of normal. And I'm not entirely sure how that gets measured and how it gets rated various different places you can send your work to. But 1 in 10 is kind of my own observed acceptance rate as well, with a few provisos. My working principle has been it's a numbers game. If I want to see my work published, then I'm just going to have to send it to all the places. And the best way of doing that is to also have a lot of stories to send out. So I've written a fair few stories for Lies League. I've written a fair few stories which don't fit into Lies League, partly because of word count. And I keep writing the stories, and I keep on coming up with the ideas, which is great, but also it drives me mad at times because I'll suddenly remember I started writing a story and then have to wait for a folder and then, there it is. And it's only like a third written, and then I'll kind of go, now what am I going to do with this? And I have a lot of those story stems. I have a folder which is just so full of beginnings, and it's my working folder, and it's got 100 plus files in, which are all stories that have never been finished. Every so often I'll basically see a call out for something, and that will remind me that I've written a story, something along that idea, and I'll go off and finish it. And every so often I'll look at it and kind of go, actually, no, I can now see my way through for that story. So sometimes they're just cogitating, and sometimes I've just forgotten they exist, frankly, and sometimes I'm working on them. So I tend to be working on maybe half a dozen story ideas at a time, but I'll concentrate on whichever one I think has a deadline that I need to write for, I suppose. But the ideas come quicker than the amount of time allowed to write, which is the frustrating thing, because I come up with quite a lot of them, and I really ought to get better at combining multiple ideas into one story, because that might actually help reduce the number of stories I have to write and also make them more interesting. But I've yet to kind of quite nail how to do that. So this year, with the whole lockdown thing, last year I did a little bit of freelance work, which kind of knocked the writing, the word count down a bit. And this year I kind of went, well, I need to tackle writing more stories, not just submitting. So I set myself a goal, which I've been monitoring in another spreadsheet, because spreadsheets are your friend, especially when you have this number of stories out there. And I've been aiming to write a certain number of words per day, which is on average about 800, which is not that many. I was doing okay at the start of the year, and I was doing okay for the first month of lockdown, and then I hit sort of lockdown brain melts, and the graph just kind of like, it meanders a little bit, and I've been trying to haul it back up to that original target, and I'm getting closer, but I'm still about 12,000 words short of where I wanted to be, which I probably will get to at the end of the year, just because it's a goal and I don't like to miss them. It's a goal which is roughly 300,000 words for the year, of which I expect about half of that to be finished stories, which is about 2 novels, I suppose, 2 novels equivalent, and would be for my normal sort of 2,000 word stories in the region of, 80 stories? Yeah, that's about right.
You're making me feel lazy, Liam.
Yes, but I am doing this as my full-time job, and I'm not trying to run a publishing house or anything else, and I myself feel very lazy when I see other people's word counts bandied around, because 800 a day is a reasonable target if you also have a full-time job, or it seems to work. It's still quite a lot of short stories, obviously, so my prolific nature is kind of reputation is defended, even without possibly being that remarkable to me. I think as soon as people know that that's my main activity, it should less remarkable, I think.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you can't just sit there and write, or you never get any ideas.
Be a bigger problem for people who write about real life than people who write about fantasy.
Yes.
I get my ideas from everywhere and anything, and sometimes it will be, the phrase about in London you're never more than 6 foot away from a rat was enough of a single nugget to create a whole story from, which was also in London Lies. That's rat, of course. So sometimes it doesn't take a lot for me to come up with an idea, and apparently they're doing boat tours of the cruise ships stranded in the channel, because of course they're not going anywhere.
Off Weymouth Bay.
They don't want to be in harbour all the time because there are harbour fees, so they're basically just sitting in the channel doing nothing for a long period and coming in every so often for supplies. And I was kind of going, okay, well, I can work that into a story, and I started writing that, but setting it in space. Which is my normal go-to when something is happening here, and then I kind of go, how can I make that more interesting? Set it in space is normally a way to do it. But anything can turn up with an idea, or I'll read something and I like that style, so I want to write something in that style.
Yes, because we didn't really talk about the stylistic differences, did we? Because quite a lot of the stories in this are in quite traditional formats. I'm thinking of things like The Burden and The Swordmaster, which are actually in some ways quite similar in format and tone, but go different directions. And I can hear echoes of particular cultures. So like Swordmaster, I see it as a samurai, even though you don't say that. Because it's just that thing about the sword being that important to someone, and also the sort of the testing of the bloody idiot seems somehow to go very much into that field, and Scarecrow fits into that field as well, I think.
Literally,
in that case, yes. But the sort of the lone hero, in very carefully inverted commas, arriving somewhere and being set some kind of task, and
which is very much
dealing with it in his own particular way.
But I suspect that's. I mean, there is a process of osmosis which is inevitable, and it probably varies from writer to writer depending on what they were reading as quite a young person, I suspect.
Yeah.
I mean, this is slightly odd to be talking about because, of course, this is an anthology of fantasy, but I mainly read short science fiction stories as a kid. I didn't get a lot of short fantasy form. I'm not entirely sure there was that much compared to science fiction short stories. Asimov was churning out anthologies of short science fiction all the time, and I'm not sure there was that many fantasy equivalents.
There were.
It may be what was available in the second-hand bookshop, and it may well even be.
Yeah, there's that. Yes,
because
you possibly didn't have a mother who collected. My parents have an entire room just of science fiction and an entire room just of fantasy, and they started collecting in the mid-50s.
Okay.
And I read all of it, and my God, a lot of it's rubbish.
This is also inevitable. But certainly from the short story science fiction reading, and particularly Asimov, his writing style is actually quite direct and simple, which isn't to say his stories are, but there aren't that many sort of linguistic tricks. It's very plainly written, and it's very directly written. And I think that is the power of a well-written short story, in that, some people will write beautiful language. And we get quite a lot, obviously, for the slush reading for Lions League, we get quite a lot of stuff where, it's well written, it's beautifully written, but there's no story there, and it's relatively rare that we'll get a story where there's a good story there, but it's badly written. It's very rare that we get that, but it's quite often we'll get something beautifully written, but there's no story, and that's really frustrating because it's obvious the person can write, and it's obvious they've got a lovely way of saying things, but the story's missing. So reading short stories of traditional nature, I suspect, has probably driven certain of my writing style, in that I quite like to write a story relatively plainly. I don't tend to go for... There's always a bit of Douglas Adams wordplay in there, which sometimes gets edited out because those are my darlings, I suppose. Something that will make me almost chortle when I read it out loud may not actually be suitable for the story. So there's quite often a little bit of wordplay in there, but there's not that much, and they tend to be written as directly as I can, I suppose. And I'll edit that way as well. I'll tend to edit down. I'll tend to edit to simplify, and certainly my preferred trick when I get editing notes from other people who try and rewrite a sentence for me is to kind of simplify it to the bare minimum at that point. It's obviously my version's failed, their version is their version, and I'll largely put a red line through the whole thing and reduce it down to the bare minimum, which isn't always what I do, but it does tend to quite often work. Something has jarred them out of the story, so let's cut as much of that bit as possible. And I'll do that when I'm editing for myself as well. I'll try and simplify things down. And that's possibly, again, a Liars League influence, because their word count limit is 2,000 words.
And it's got to work aloud.
And it's also got to work aloud, which is a good point as well,
thing,
because we'll get some stories where beautiful, but it takes 2 reads to understand it. So yes, 2,000 words, relatively direct, relatively simple, but there's also got to be a punch in there. There's got to be something that actually makes it stand out as a story, and quite often that's the idea, and sometimes it's the ending. I'm sorry about those endings, but there's something in there that basically, hopefully, should stay with the listener or the reader afterwards.
Yes. All of these, I mean, I'm just looking at the titles, and there's not a single one I'm thinking, I wonder what that one was. But they absolutely stand up and do the job and do it extremely well, all of them. Even the ones that I hesitated over. Bring Rope, which I think just gave me the creeps too much.
Oh, that wasn't...
And I was saying, I really don't know if I want this in here. It doesn't fit. And really what it was is, it's upsetting me.
That one was inspired by a picture I saw at the Affordable Art Fair that just looked like a black cloud with ropes coming out of it, and I went, okay, no, that's my idea for a story now.
Here we go.
And it was very much inspired by that, but it is different because it is urban fantasy, which is slightly different from most of the others.
Well,
The Black Bull is possibly the equivalent, but, it's a lot less.
Yeah, and Temp, but, I mean, very differently, because Temp is definitely an urban fantasy, but also it's funny, and funny is not something I would say about Bring Rope.
No, Bring Rope. Bring Rope has very little humour in.
Yeah, and there's almost this divide in your writing that it's either really dark and bitter dark, or it's really quite sunny, even when you're being quite demanding of the reader emotionally. It's still that there's one or the other with you. There's not, you don't seem to get them both into the same thing. I'm
not sure they're not slightly contradictory. I mean, the humour is obviously...
I'm not saying they are. I'm just saying that there's a very broad one or the other. And one of the things that I think I was doing without even realising it was balancing that when I was saying which ones we would have.
Absolutely. Humour is often, your defence against darkness.
Exactly.
And, I like my dark, slightly comedic stories. Again, probably a Douglas Adams as much as everything else. And they're definitely in there. But occasionally the humour doesn't fit because the story just is a heck of a lot darker, either at the end of it or just as I'm writing. So Kingdom is definitely of that nature.
Yeah.
There's no joy to be had in that story in terms of, there's nothing redeeming in terms of their future, or there's no humour in there. It's just dark and gets horrible and gets more horrible.
Well, yes, but it is also humane. The thing that I particularly remember from that story, apart from all the detail of nastiness, was the thing about the cooking. And helping the cook, because of course the cook can't see to cook.
Yeah.
You don't want to burn the house down.
No, he's a good king. He can
that
be.
Little touch in there, and I just thought, yeah, that's exactly how it would be under these circumstances. And that lit that moment and made the whole of the rest of it that much worse in terms of the, oh God, this is terrible, these poor people thing. And if that hadn't been in there, I think it would have just perhaps been a bit unremitting.
Yep.
So that was a really important moment in that story for me. That was the one. That was the point at which I said, yes, we'll have this one, because that held it together somehow. Just that little detail. And I don't know if you were aware of that when you were writing it, but that was definitely what leapt out.
Well, probably not. But it was probably included largely for the desire to make sure that, when you look back at it, you kind of go, well, of course somebody has to help the cook with a knife.
Yeah.
Kind of, in the same way, you get clues about, injuries to people who are the woodcutters And it's
Yeah.
kind of like, well, of course they're going to be injured. They're woodcutters and they can't see what they're doing. So there are definitely a sprinkling of clues that, without stating what's actually happening, which is the conceit of that story. Really, is to not make it obvious what is going on until it becomes inevitable.
Inevitable, yeah. Yes, I do like a bit of inevitability in a story. It's sort of I can see this car crash coming, and there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah. And certainly, as soon as you basically don't allow these people to be heroes, and you don't throw in
fallibility,
Tex McKenna kind of thing, you're kind of going, well, it's quite often going to end badly for them. But not always. Sometimes things get a little bit better, but quite often no. I mean, Time of the Devourer, I love the ending of, because it's very, very human. This person basically smiling at finding grey hairs. It's kind of, it is
at last.
kind of, but it is also, why would anyone smile at that? But when you read the story, you kind of, it makes sense.
Yeah, and I do love your crones.
Yeah, the crone
various crones in various disguises.
The crone is going to have
the same crone, really, aren't they? But,
Carrie loves the crone as well, and I have Viking crones for Carrie as much as anything else.
I write stuff for Carrie sometimes.
Yeah.
She fancies
really
something. I want something. So, yes, okay. I wrote my mermaid story for her.
Right. No, I love the idea of. Also, it's the whole gender mixing up thing. I could just write about men, but that would be very boring. And in fact, the main reason, in some ways, to write from the perspective of women is that stories tend to be about conflict, and how do you make a conflict harder on the protagonist? You generally make them a woman, which is terrible. That's the kind of truth of things. But it does mean that they have more to battle against. So I do, whenever I can, write a female protagonist. But the crone is wonderful because it's this female protagonist who actually doesn't really care in a way. She's already won, is the crone's attitude. The crone is basically, she's there as this little prodding figure saying, why do you want your son to be a hero, or why do you want to be younger, or whatever it is. And they're already kind of, they've won in some way because they've got to a position where they're kind of comfortable.
They've lived to grow old for a start.
Well, they've grown old, so they've achieved a lot more than a lot of my other characters in my stories do, I'm afraid. But they've got a point of wisdom as well. So there's actually, To Be a Hero's got the crone in. The Painted Platform's got the crone in.
Yeah.
I've written one other story with the same crone as To Be a Hero, which is, about an age difference between a husband and a wife. And she basically comes with him in a kind of wheelchair and asks for him to be younger so that they can be equally aged. So there's that one, and there's and also Under the L.
Under the L,
which is recently done yesterday on your noon broadcast, which was lovely to hear again. So there's probably a half dozen crone
and
stories.
Of course, Miscellaneous Spooky Weird is very much in the same model.
Although she's a very different figure.
She is.
She's not a crone.
No, but they are
some
probably
people may
her
debate.
ancestors.
Absolutely, but there is some commonality, but she is definitely not my crone that I think about when I think of a crone.
But in terms of her approach to life, right, let's sort this out.
Which is probably,
of knowing how to sort it out.
It's a little Terry Pratchett inspired, probably.
Yes.
Granny Weatherfax.
Yes.
But that's because he wrote such a wonderful character. It's this fairly, hard character, but that she's got all the best intentions. She just knows the ways of the world, and she knows what's going to work and what isn't, and she's not going to sugarcoat it.
No.
Which is a wonderful character to write.
Granny Weatherwax often.
Indeed.
I amn't dead. Just for starters. Okay. I mean, there's not really any point in saying, what are you working on at the moment? It's 30-odd stories, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's definitely true. There's a fair few working on at the moment. Not a huge number of deadlines I've got to write for at the moment, which is actually slightly annoying, because that kind of helps me sometimes focus in. And what I've been attempting to do this year is submit at least half my stories to the pro-rate markets, which has probably had a huge negative impact on my acceptance rate, but that's not a bad thing. But I'm looking around for anthologies to write for, I suppose, with enough of a lead-up time to actually do it a decent job. It's sometimes a bit tricky because when some of the calls are very particular and the word count's 5,000, you're kind of going, well, I could write you a 5,000-word story, but if it doesn't get in here, it's not going in anywhere. And that can be very awkward. I tend to prefer stories where... How
much do I want to invest in this?
Yeah, but I tend to prefer a story that's not so set in one particular theme or world that it has no other homes. It's easier to write for, probably, in a way, but also it has a lot more potential markets to be sent to. So, yeah, writing some of those things. What else? The lovely Newcom Press, which do the best of British science fiction and best of British fantasy. And I'm very, very delighted to have now 3 stories in 3 of their best-ofs. So I'm with best-ofs. I was hoping for best of each of different types. They, as I say, they do science fiction and fantasy, but they used to do horror. I thought I had a strong contender for the best of British horror, but that was the year they stopped doing it, which is a massive shame. And I'm hoping somebody at some point steps forward and wants to do best of British horror, and I suspect that won't be you.
No, it won't.
The thematic and the pain of writing really bleak horror, and I can imagine reading the slush pile for the best of British horror would be
painful.
You would need a lot of wine to get through it, that one, I suspect.
I mean, the things I have to read, despite having said don't send to me.
Well, quite. I mean, your whole...
just think, but I'm special. No, you bloody not.
No. I mean, you're very, very particular on the spider anthology, that no spiders were to be harmed, and no people either, kind of in that sort of degree, unless there was good cause. So yeah, it won't be you, I know that much. But I am still hoping that there is one, just so I can kind of try and complete the set. So I'm doing that, and I've got another publication in Analog, which for your room full of science fiction stories, Analog's been going for donkey's years, and it being one of the main. I think. But there's another one coming that I've just not an idea when. Which is lovely because that these names are the names that you see in your you pull out a science fiction anthology and it will say first published here, and it'll be Asimov's and Clark's World and Analog and Fantasy and Science Fiction and a few others. And to actually get in amongst there means that you can put your name against some of the certainly the other people in that same volume, which is lovely, but also you can kind of go, I'm in the same thing as all these other famous writers.
Yes, all these golden greats. Yeah.
Golden greats, exactly. And that, what I was saying about, what I was reading when I was a kid, I was pretty much reading the golden greats. Some of them weren't that great.
Weren't that great, no.
Be that gold. I read quite a lot of stuff, and at the time I knew it was pulp. E. Doc Smith's Lensman series was very much kind of like I was reading it and kind of, wait a minute, but it was fun to read, but you look at it and kind of go, really? And it's almost a shame in a way that they get rejudged, I suppose, but you do look at some of them, and even at the time, you're kind of going, what's this really saying?
Yes. I came across I can't actually remember who it was by now, but I came across a short story that I'd read when I was about 16, and it was in an anthology, and I had remembered the last line. But I read almost the whole of the story without realising it was that story, because the last line was what worked. And I thought, God, this is such a pedestrian load of nonsense, except for the last line. We learn, don't we, basically?
We do, and we often...
And when people are doing it first, there's nothing to judge them against.
Well, yes, but also we learn by reading, which is what I was going to say, was, you can go on as many creative writing courses as you like, but absorbing by reading stuff you like and also don't like, I think tells you a huge amount. It's one of the main justifications for, slush readers not ending up being paid. But, I was on a Zoom meeting where Neil Clark was talking about Clark's World, and he was saying, this is what our slush readers get out of it, which is they get to see what works and what doesn't work without being so close to it, which you are when you read your own work. And then you can turn the lessons that you learn onto your own work. You only read stuff that's published, you'll probably go, well, everyone can write great stories.
Yeah, because you haven't seen the failures.
You haven't seen the stuff that's not been published. But even then, when you look at it a little slightly more critically, you'll read stuff and kind of go, why is this one in this anthology? So there are bookstores full of books. Are they all good? Possibly not. But no, the only way to actually develop that process of your own sort of skill, I suppose, is by reading as much as possible.
You spot the mistakes you make in somebody else's piece, and you
or just even,
that doesn't work, does it?
Well, just different ways of doing things, because if you only read one style, then you will only learn how to mimic that one style.
Coming back to this rejection thing, because I enjoy your attitude to it, apart from anything else. But how often typically does something get rejected before it gets accepted?
Ooh.
Have you done your statistics on that?
No, not really. The spreadsheet doesn't really help quite that much on that front. I do know that the story that's possibly had the most rejections, certainly over time, has just been accepted, and that's now a 20-year-old story.
Yeah.
So that in itself is a kind of like, well, hey, which is it's a story that's had probably more feedback than anything else. And even, it won a kind of like a semi-professional feedback because it placed in a contest where it was peer-reviewed, and most people liked it. So it got bumped up to this, like, you can win a professional review, and the professional person hated it, loathed it with a vengeance, and basically said it shouldn't even have been in the contest. So that was instructive in a way, and I can see kind of why. Because
a
again,
market thing, do you think?
Well, it's partly playing with that whole hero thing. In addition to not writing about heroes, I wrote a story where it was a person with a major character flaw, which should make them fairly horrible, and they end up being the hero. And that, I think, disgruntled a lot of traditional story narrative people who are kind of going, you can't have that person win, even though they don't win because they die at the end. But they're hero, and you can't have that. So there was a visceral reaction to my playing with the form, I suppose, which, and you can kind of see why in some way. The whole you have to learn the rules before you can break the rules. But I just had huge fun breaking the rules, so and I still do.
But also, when you're getting that kind of no, you mustn't reaction, I tend to think there's something in this.
There is, but finding a home was a real trick. And I eventually found a home where they were looking for stories which basically broke taboos.
Ah.
It required
So that was a
niche
Jewish then.
could find it at home.
Yeah.
It hasn't quite been published yet, and there's always a possibility that doesn't happen. Fingers crossed that happen. It does happen occasionally. You'll get an acceptance, but before...
Yeah, and then something goes wrong. Yeah.
Very annoying. In terms of number of times before a story gets accepted, I'm always surprised if it's first time. I don't expect that, and I suspect that is... I suspect what I'm not doing, and I really should be doing, is sitting on a story for a little while, digging it out of the drawer, and then revising it.
Yeah.
I'll tend to finish it because there's a theme and a deadline. I'll send it off. It will get rejected, and then I'll rework it before I send it to the next place, which effectively does the same job, but it means that I don't expect a story necessarily to get accepted the first time. It will probably have flaws. I just sent off a story, and then 5 minutes later I went, oh, that would have been a better title for it, which is really annoying, but happens. So I don't expect the first time. I suspect that most of the ones that are good stories get accepted within about 5 submissions. I suppose. But I'm still averaging around about the 1 in 10 sort of rate. 8% this year, which is, as I said, probably largely due to my aiming for pro markets by 50%. So that kind of reduces your acceptance rate. But my acceptance rate this year so far is 8%, which is perfectly decent when you're sending out a lot of stories. It's fairly demoralizing if you're not sending out a lot of stories, because that means you can send out, 10 stories in a year and get no acceptances and think you're rubbish. But you just haven't sent out enough to, there's a stats to work for you. So I do think people who've got stories should send them out.
Hello, my name is Liam Hogan, author of Happy Ending Not Guaranteed. I'm going to be reading you an extract from Mechanical, which is narrated by a young female chess player, something you'll have to use your imagination for until I hope it becomes obvious. Mechanical. Knight to b4, von Compellen said, his English only lightly accented. The itch on the end of my nose was getting worse, but I ignored it, just as I ignored the urge to lift the edge of the blindfold. My hands still smarted from the last attempt, and if I hadn't been promised payment, I'd have jacked it in then and there. My stomach rumbled. This stupid game had gone on far too long. Bishop to e5 revealed check, I replied. I heard the wooden piece clacking down to its new home on the board, and a half grunt from my opponent. King to c7, I interrupted. Unwise. Knight to d5, checkmate. Your best move is pawn to b3, but it will cost you your queen. You should have taken the exchange when you had the chance. My, you are the impatient one. Still, you may remove the blindfold, miss. How little they thought of me to forget my name already. Haley, I said, as I pulled away the strip of dark cloth. Sarah Haley, and I believe you owe me a half-crown, Herr von Compellen. I had not expected the lazy smile with which this was met, and my fingers almost flew to the blade I kept hidden in the lining of my coat. All in good time, von Compellen drawled. Tell me, Miss Haley, what is your height? My height? What the devil? 5'2", wouldn't you say, Mr. Doyle? Miss Doyle spoke for the first time since he'd blindfolded me. 5'1", sir, and either 93 or 94 pounds. I'll stake a shilling on it. Well, you're the expert, Mr. Doyle, von Compellen said. Mr. Doyle was a hangman, and a very good one, before he found his way to me. You know how a hangman judges the weight of the condemned? I shuddered, as I remembered Mr. Doyle's firm handshake. Now look, calm yourself, Miss Daly. Mr. Doyle, a half-crown, if you will. But if you want more, a half-crown a day, plus food and lodging, then come see me tomorrow at 5 o'clock. I caught the coin as it flew across the smoky room, but I didn't move, not yet. A girl has to put up with a lot to make it in this world, and I preferred the games to remain firmly on the checkered board. "Is this about the Turk?" I asked defiantly. "Ah," von Capellen grinned. "It seems our reputation precedes us, Mr. Doyle." Of course it did. The mechanical Turk was the sensation of the day. I'd learnt about it from my father, God rest his soul, but back then it was reported irreparably broken, until it had reappeared over the Channel in Paris a little under a year ago. And now here it was, newly arrived in London. "If you're going to ask me to play against the Turk, sir," I said, "I don't need to come back tomorrow to decide. I'll gladly do it." "Good girl," von Capellen smiled. "You'll take my pay then and come into my service. But there are two things you need to know. The first is that my business is my business. I will not stand for loose talk, and the disclosure of the secrets of any of my inventions will not go unpunished. You can, I trust, keep a secret." "I can, if the pay is regular." "It is." He held out his hand, and I looked at it suspiciously. He had yet to tell me the other thing I needed to know. Still, a half-crown a day was a persuasive argument, and I assumed we would go no further unless I agreed. I shook. "And the second thing?" I asked, our hands still joined. His smile stretched from ear to ear. "Why, Miss Haley, I don't want you to play the Turk. I want you to be the Turk."